Hey everybody, and welcome to this course where we will now cover the back end of full stack programming. So now we get to see what the server-side programming looks like, starting this journey of how do we communicate with databases eventually. Now we're going to be covering server-side programming in the context of Node, so we're going to be using JavaScript, and eventually we'll be using a library called Express, which is the JavaScript library made for making servers. Now, before we jump into creating servers and all that fun stuff, we need to go over some terms just to make sure we conceptually know the high-end vocabulary of what we'll be working with. All right, so first let's differentiate what is the front end versus what is the back end. You know, if you're new to this, it can still be a very foreign thing, the back end. So what the back end is, it is the server and the database that the client interacts with. It's anything that the user doesn't directly interact with, which as we've seen is the front end. Anything you've built in React or JavaScript or HTML, CSS, that's all front end. Also referred to as the client. Something the client uses, like a browser or a computer, to access your application. So what I have here is a little graphic to kind of explain these features again. You may remember this briefly from the HTTP sections that we covered, but let's just review this here. So what I have here is what we call the client. Again, this is the computer, the device a person is accessing your application on. Now the client, in order to get data and perform operations, if it's not a static site, meaning it's not just supposed to display information that never changed, but it's actually something the user can interact with, you know, think Twitter or Facebook, the information for that site has to be stored somewhere. And to get to that information, we need to make requests to this intermediary. So the client will make requests via HTTP. We'll say request here. And the first thing that receives that request is the server. Now the server does do some things, and eventually it sends back a response. So I'll say response here. Okay, so we're going to be really focusing on this request response cycle. We've worked with the front end, we've made requests to servers, but now what does it look like to be on that receiving end? You're receiving the request and sending a response back to the client making the request. Now let's differentiate quickly here in this schema of things. What is the front end, what is the back end? This right here is the front end. Everything else over here, this is the back end. All right. We will talk a little bit more about what this interaction looks like. Just to briefly talk about it though, the server does receive these requests from the client and will eventually need to send that request to a database. And the database will then send back the information the server is requesting, so the server can then forward it back onto the client. We're not going to worry about this connection just yet. We're going to be using fake data for the next couple of lessons, just so we can get this cycle down really good, and then we can add in this last piece. What this last piece is over here is the API. Another term you may have heard of before, maybe not be familiar with. The API is what does all the logic in between what the server's been asked to do. API goes and does that, gets the data or updates the data in the database so that the server can now receive that updated information and forward it to the client. So we will talk about APIs a bit as we will be building some APIs into our servers, but we won't be interacting with any databases just yet. That's what we got here. Once you know this whole process, that is full stack engineering. It's what this course is aiming to help you build skills for, is this whole process. All right, but let's talk about a few more terms before we end this video. So another few terms to add here. There's two types of servers I want to differentiate right off the bat. There are remote servers and there are local. So if you think remote is anything that is not your device. So if you access a website that's hitting up a server and you're not hosting that server on your own device, it is remote. So it could be on a computer in another room, or it could be in a server farm thousands of miles away. That's remote. Local is running a server on your local machine. Now, if you've played with React or any of those libraries, you ran local development servers to view your web page live as you're developing them. So that is one type of a local server. We're going to be building another kind here that we can actually interact with, actually making the back end. All right, but what makes this all possible? Why can we do all this with JavaScript? If you recall from earlier in lessons, we talked about Node.js. Now, Node is the JavaScript engine, again, installed on your computer, so you're able to write JavaScript as a programming language, not just a website language. This is why we can use things like Express to build backend technologies using JavaScript. So this entire course we'll be writing our code using Node. All right, and that about does it for this brief introduction to server-side programming. So when you're ready, join me in the next episode where we will go further into this. All right, see you there.